Welcome to Occult Archives. We uncover the mysteries and myths and legends behind history's, most feared books, from mystical grimoires to ancient religious secrets, too dangerous to be read. I am joined today by, an expert in this area, and we're going to be going on a deep dive today into Shaman, Saiva, and Sufi, hidden currents of magic, mysticism, and syncretic power in Southeast Asia.
So this is going to be a really fascinating look into the Malay Peninsula, and we're using a text by R.O. Winstedt as our guide.
Excellent.
Shaman, Saiva, and Sufi.
Perfect. Now, this isn't just like, a dry historical account of some random region of the world. What makes this region so interesting and frankly so captivating is the really vibrant, sometimes surprising fusion of ancient indigenous beliefs with the profound influence of Saiva Hinduism.
And then, of course, later on you have the arrival of Sufi Islam.
Right, exactly.
So you've got this incredible mix. Imagine it as like a hidden archive where you've got these magical practices, these mystical ideas from very different worlds, all coming together, intertwining, and creating something really unique.
Yeah, and when you were describing that, the image that came to mind was you have the local spirits, and then on top of that, you've got Hindu deities, and then on top of that, it's like you're adding another layer of Islamic mysticism onto these age-old rituals. It's like a parfait or something.
Right. Yeah, it's like a spiritual parfait.
And so our, mission in this deep dive is really to kind of uncover the key elements of this syncretic, I love that word syncretic, the syncretic spiritual landscape.
Yeah.
It's just it feels so academic.
Yeah. It really encapsulates it, though,
Yeah,
right?
it totally does.
Yeah.
And it's not enough just to say, oh, these were the beliefs. What we want to understand is how they interacted, how they influenced each other, and what kind of unique forms of power and understanding emerged from that. So where do we even begin? Let's start with the very foundation, right? The diverse pantheon of gods, spirits, ghosts that populated this world.
Okay, so before Islam, and even continuing after its arrival, you've got this world teeming with unseen entities.
Right.
There were indigenous spirits of the land. And then you have this fundamental concept. It's called semangat. It's a vital life force that's believed to reside in, everything.
Oh, interesting.
So it's kind of like the soul. And then, of course, with the coming of Hinduism, you have a whole new cast of divine figures entering the scene.
Right. And it wasn't just a simple adoption, was it?
Yeah.
You have a figure like Shiva, for instance.
Oh, Siva.
It's not like he was just transplanted from India and that was it. He seems to have actually resonated with existing Malay figures.
Definitely.
Winstedt mentions this, enigmatic, black awang. He's even addressed by actors as the king of the earth.
Yeah.
And that connection, I think, suggests a deeper resonance between Siva's attributes and whatever ideas of power the Malays already had.
Yeah, it's fascinating how they didn't just take Siva wholesale.
Yeah.
They integrated different facets of him into their existing beliefs. So he appears as Mahadeva, for example, sometimes becoming Maharaja Dewa, a white genie of the sun.
Okay.
He's also Batara Guru, the revered divine teacher. But, significantly, the Malays also embraced his more formidable side, right? As Kala, the destroyer.
Yeah.
The dread lord of the sea. So you have this multifaceted adoption of this deity.
Right. And you have this really interesting figure called the Spectre Huntsman.
Yes.
Malay magicians, they linked him to Siva, even using similar titles. And Winstedt draws this fascinating parallel to the Germanic god Woden.
Yeah.
They're both these storm gods leading these spectral hosts.
Leading these spectral hosts, yeah.
It makes you wonder if there are these ancient Indo-European connections in the realm of storm deities and this idea of the wild hunt.
It's a fascinating thought. It makes you wonder, if you consider the broader picture, this shared motif of a storm god leading a wild hunt, it's found across cultures that are separated by vast distances.
Right.
So it suggests this deep, maybe even primal human fascination with the power of storms and the spirits that are associated with them. And you see this in other ways, too. For example, the Malay association of Siva with the tiger god, Gaffer Longclaws, that actually echoes similar syncretisms found in certain tribes in India.
Okay.
And even the hero Arjuna is woven into this mix. He's sometimes seen as an earth spirit and a king of the sea. So, it really is this constantly evolving spiritual tapestry.
And it's not just Sivi either, right?
Yeah.
Like Siva's consort is, she's not overlooked.
No, no.
Mahadevi, Kumari, and especially Sri, the goddess of the rice fields, she became very central.
Oh, absolutely.
Sri, in many ways, she embodied the nurturing aspect of the earth,
Right.
which is interesting because it kind of mirrors Siva in his Bhattara guru aspect as like a celestial father figure.
Yeah, kind of cosmic pair.
And their stories often took on a local flavor. Like, for instance, the story of Kumari's creation, like being created from eaglewood by Gaffer Masuku.
That's right, yeah. That process of localization is really key. These weren't just distant deities, they were actively integrated into the Malay environment. They were given local origins, which would have made them more relevant and relatable to the people.
Right.
And you see that with the story of Kumari having daughters by the sun and the moon gods.
Right.
It echoes earlier Malay beliefs about the divine teacher residing in the sun and the moon. It's this fascinating continuity.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it wasn't just like the major players, Vishnu, Brahma, Krishna, even Ganesha, although in a somewhat minor role as Ghana, they all found their place.
Yeah, they all found their niche in the Malay spiritual sphere.
And they were often linked to very specific magical practices. Vishnu's sword for protection, Krishna for healing snake bites. It's almost like a spiritual pharmacopoeia.
Exactly. And alongside these deities, the Hindu demons and demigods also migrated into Malay folklore, often through literary sources.
Okay.
So you have figures like Rahu, the eclipse-causing dragon, Danu, the rainbow serpent, and figures from the Ramayana like Sri Rama and Hanuman.
Right.
Interestingly, Hanuman actually undergoes a transformation in Malay folklore. He becomes a malevolent spirit.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty big change for the Monkey King.
Right. It just highlights how cultural borrowing isn't always a direct copy. These figures can be reinterpreted, repurposed within a new belief system. And then you have these vivid descriptions of Raksasa from Deccan romances, these colossal, grotesque beings with just incredible appetites. It's amazing how these literary imports were absorbed and maybe even embellished in the local imagination.
Yeah. It sounds like these imported demons, though, weren't necessarily like the primary focus for the average Malay magician. Right?
Sure. That's right. Winstedt really emphasizes that the older, more deeply rooted beliefs, the spirits of deceased mortals and these other local entities, they retained their power. So new ideas were adopted, but they didn't necessarily erase the pre-existing spiritual landscape.
So let's delve into that a bit. This reverence for the spirits of the dead. It just seems so profoundly ingrained.
Oh, absolutely.
And we're not talking about just like vague apparitions here, right?
Yeah.
This is active ancestor veneration. People are seeking blessings at graves, especially at Karamat, these sacred tombs. And this could be the final resting place of both Muslim and non-Muslim individuals. So what does that tell us about the continuity of sacred sites across religious shifts?
It speaks volumes, right? And the signs of a Karamat sanctity were often supernatural. For instance, the seemingly impossible lengthening of the space between grave markers.
Oh, wow.
And people would make vows at these locations. Failing to fulfill them was believed to invite misfortune.
Oh, interesting.
And the connection between certain Karamat and specific animals, like tigers appearing from the graves of respected figures, that's just striking. It really speaks to this potent spiritual link between the deceased and the natural world.
Right, and it's not just ancestors either.
Right? Not at all.
It's a whole spectrum of other spirits, nature spirits, inhabiting specific places, forgotten godlings, perhaps remnants of even older belief systems.
Yeah.
And then you have these kind of liminal figures like the specter huntsman, who is like both a ghost and a manifestation of Siva.
Right.
Or Black Awang, who in one description sounds distinctly like a Negrito.
Yeah.
Which, hints at these very ancient origins of this figure and its potential connection to like the earliest inhabitants of the peninsula.
That fluid boundary between spirit and ghost is so fascinating. You also have these bachelor spirits, for example, who might represent deities that faded from prominence or young people who died prematurely.
Okay.
And then there's the fairy princess of Mount Ladang, who stands out, right? She's a figure with an almost mythical origin story.
Right.
Complete with these bizarre demands when a sultan sought her hand in marriage. Her tale feels almost like a localized legend layered onto older beliefs about these powerful female spirits associated with the land.
Yeah, that's quite the royal suitor test.
It really is.
You also have Granny Kamang.
Yes, Granny Kamang, mysterious figure linked to rice cultivation. Sometimes she's this benevolent embodiment of the rice soul.
Right.
Other times she's a more sinister, vampire-like entity born from the afterbirth. This duality, it really illustrates that complex and sometimes contradictory nature of these folk beliefs.
Yeah, definitely. And then, we shouldn't forget the more kind of localized, often malevolent spirits.
Yes.
Dream demons like Makopek, who brings nightmares, kitchen demons, and these shapeless entities that are blamed for causing illness.
Yeah, formless spirits, yeah.
And then you have the concept of body, which are these malevolent auras that are associated with violent deaths or certain animals, which, suggests this belief in a kind of lingering spiritual residue from traumatic events.
Yes.
So, okay, we've got this incredibly, layered pantheon.
It's a crowded spiritual ecosystem.
It really is.
It really is. And then, as we know, Islam arrives.
Right.
Bringing its own supernatural inhabitants. Jinn, angels, devils. So the question becomes, how did these new figures interact with this existing, already complex spiritual landscape?
Yeah, it's like, did they just wipe out everything that was there before, or did they kind of merge and mingle?
Well,
Okay, so we've got this layered pantheon, all these different figures, all these different forces at play. How did this then shape the role and the practices of, the Malay magician?
Well, the Malay magician underwent an evolution. Winstedt traces this progression from, animistic experts who were skilled in specific crafts and rituals
Okay.
to shamans who actively interacted with and even controlled spirits. They had familiar spirits to help them.
So initially it was more about, specialized knowledge
Yeah.
and ritual expertise, maybe tied to, practical needs, like agriculture or healing,
Right.
rather than direct engagement with, a spirit world.
Exactly. In the early rice cultivation rites, for instance, an older woman often played this crucial role.
Right.
And their age and experience, it was believed to be beneficial for the crop's fertility.
Okay.
Persuasion and symbolic language, those were the tools of this earlier form of magic.
Interesting.
But then the shaman emerges, and their direct connection to the spirit realm becomes central to their power.
So it sounds like this shamanic figure held a position of both, respect and a certain level of apprehension.
Oh, definitely.
Winstedt notes that, Malays viewed the exercise of their power with considerable dread. What might have been at the root of that?
Well, I think it probably stemmed from their ability to interact with potentially dangerous spiritual forces.
Right.
And you see this in the way Islam viewed these practices. Islam was more critical of shamans who conducted seances and summoned spirits compared to medicine men who used more overtly Islamic charms. But within the magical community itself, shamans often held a higher status.
Oh, interesting.
So it seems like there was a recognition of their potent abilities, even if it was mixed with fear.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how did one actually become a shaman? Was it formal training, a hereditary calling, or some kind of spiritual initiation?
It could manifest in various ways. Sometimes it was through inheritance, receiving a familiar spirit passed down from a relative or mentor. Dreams were also a significant avenue for being called to this role. And then there were rituals, often involving solitary vigils at grave sites,
Right.
which kind of underscores the connection to the spirits of the dead.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is, even within these rituals, you see that syncretic element.
Oh.
Some Kelantan practices, for example, involved the invocation of spirits of murdered individuals alongside Islamic figures to enhance their power.
So you're invoking both the earthly and the spiritual to try to gain magical potency.
Exactly. And this blending of different traditions becomes even more prominent with the arrival of Hindu influences.
So how did those shape the figure of the Malay magician?
Well, even before the arrival of Islam, Hinduism introduced the concept of asceticism as a means for magicians to amplify their powers.
Okay.
Malay romances often depict heroes gaining magical abilities through solitary retreats in mountainous regions, and Hindu deities were increasingly incorporated into charms and invocations, which would have added another layer of spiritual authority to their practices.
So the magician's repertoire was expanding, drawing from multiple spiritual traditions.
Yeah. And then, of course, you have the arrival of Islam.
Right, right. So what impact did that have on this already kind of complex figure?
Well, Islam brought its own set of tools and concepts. So the names of Allah and Muhammad began to appear in incantations, sometimes alongside older, less orthodox elements.
Okay.
Islamic divination techniques and Kabbalistic talismans were adopted. There were even instances of Malay magicians adopting pantheistic interpretations of Islamic mysticism.
So like blurring the lines between the divine and the human.
Exactly. Which, from an Orthodox perspective could be seen as quite unorthodox.
Right, right. It sounds like they were constantly kind of integrating, absorbing these different traditions, creating like a uniquely Malay form of magic.
Hmm.
Now, Winstedt also mentions this interesting connection between the Malay magician and like the king.
Oh, yeah.
What was the nature of that relationship?
It was a significant one. Among some Proto-Malay tribes, the chief actually held the roles of judge, priest, and magician all combined.
Wow.
And even later, you see these distinct parallels between rulers and magicians. Both were sometimes believed to have influence over the weather, for example.
Oh, yeah.
Both often came from specific hereditary lineages. They even shared a kind of taboo language, with particular terms used for royal actions. It really suggests a shared sphere of power and influence rooted in both the earthly and the spiritual realms.
Almost like a language of power reserved for those in positions of authority.
Yes, exactly.
And it's interesting because both the shaman and the ruler were influenced by these Hindu concepts that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And both often possess like wonder-working insignia. For example, the state shaman in Perak, he held a very high position, sometimes even considered as a potential successor to the sultan. That really speaks to their importance.
It really does. And the rituals surrounding the king, such as the annual ceremony to expel malevolent spirits from the land, or the seance conducted to revive the Perak regalia,
Oh.
these often placed the state magician in a central role. So it really highlights this intertwined nature of, secular and spiritual authority.
Right, and there was this strong belief that both living and deceased rulers, they possess these supernatural abilities that could actually impact the well-being of the kingdom.
Absolutely.
So, it's clear that these animistic foundations were incredibly resilient.
Oh, yeah.
They provided this base upon which later religious influences were layered. So I kind of want to go a bit deeper into that.
Okay.
With the core concept of semengat and its importance in everyday life,
Okay.
particularly in something as vital as like the ritual of the rice field.
Yeah, the rice field ritual. This is where you really see those ancient beliefs persisting. The concept of semengat, this essential life force, it's really fundamental to understanding this underlying animistic worldview. And as I mentioned before, it wasn't hierarchical. Everything, people, animals, plants, even inanimate objects, it was believed to possess this semengat. However, it was considered particularly vital in things that were beneficial to humans, like rice, for example. It was this animating principle connecting all aspects of existence.
So it's this pervasive energy, this inner vitality that links everything together.
Yeah, you could say that.
And it was believed to be like somewhat fluid, capable of being transferred or replenished.
Yes.
Winstedt mentions practices like, maintaining a proper diet, rubbing with Bezor stone, or receiving the breath of a medicine man as ways to kind of restore that semengat.
Yes, absolutely. And there were beliefs about different forms of semengat residing in different parts of the body. So, for example, the head was considered particularly sacred. Things like hair and nails, they were rich in this soul substance and they had to be treated with care.
Okay.
Even saliva was believed to contain a portion of one's semengat, which explains why it's used in blessings and certain rituals.
And the idea that the semengat could be vulnerable, like susceptible to attack through personal belongings,
Yes.
or capable of leaving the body doing dreams or even being stolen by sorcery, that's pretty wild.
It really is. And that really speaks to a very different understanding of the self and its connection to the surrounding world.
Right.
Now, the individual Asemengat was also believed to manifest externally as one's shadow and one's name. So there were these taboos against, stepping on someone's shadow or uttering one's own name carelessly.
Yeah.
It was all about safeguarding this vital essence.
Right, right. Okay, so then we come to the ritual of the rice field.
Yes, the heart of it all.
It's just remarkable how this fundamental agricultural practice retained so many of these pre-Islamic animistic elements, despite the later arrival and integration of these other religious beliefs. It's like, religion comes and goes, but food is life.
Food is life. Yeah, the rice field ritual is the perfect illustration of this enduring foundation. It was deeply concerned with ensuring the well-being of the soul of the rice, appeasing the nature spirits that govern the harvest, and honoring the ancestral spirits who were believed to have, a continued influence on the land. Even the individuals who often led these rites, typically older women, that hints at this very ancient past where female roles in fertility and agriculture were prominent.
So you've got this complex ceremony, and Winstedt, he describes it in some detail.
He does, yeah.
You've got these offerings, you've got symbolic tools like the Mother Dibble, you've got the precise timing based on the stars.
Right.
You've even got mock combats that are performed before planting.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
These weren't simply practical agricultural techniques. They were deeply symbolic acts intended to establish and maintain this harmonious relationship with the spiritual forces that were believed to govern the natural world.
Right.
So, for example, the offering of 7 packets of sweet rice, the various fruits, those were all intended to attract and nourish the 7 souls of the rice.
Okay.
And then you have the inclusion of prayers to Solomon within this seemingly animistic context.
Right, which is interesting, that syncretism again.
Exactly.
Yeah, and these weren't just solitary acts either, right? Winstedt emphasizes the communal nature of these rice rituals.
Oh, absolutely.
Like bringing the whole village together in this really vital undertaking. And it reinforces the idea that the community's well-being was intrinsically linked to the spiritual health of the land and the success of the crops.
Exactly. And those mock combats to expel evil spirits before planting, that powerfully illustrates the belief that malevolent forces could directly interfere with the growth of the rice.
Yep.
That ritual action was necessary to ward them off and ensure a protected, fertile environment for the crops to flourish.
So in this whole kind of system, you have this figure of the Malay shaman who plays this, crucial role as a mediator, bridging the human and the spirit worlds. So let's talk about their seances.
Okay.
How were they conducted and what purposes do they serve within the community?
So the Malay seance, as detailed by Winstedt, bears some striking similarities to shamanic practices found in other parts of the world, like Siberia, Mongolia, for example. And healing the sick and divining the future, those were primary objectives.
Yeah.
The shaman, acting as an intermediary, would enter an altered state of consciousness. It was believed to be a form of spirit possession by their familiar spirits, who would then offer cures, avert misfortune, predict future events, or answer specific questions posed by the community.
So it's like this controlled interaction with the spirit realm, often involving this, significant shift in the shaman's consciousness. And music seems to have been like an indispensable element.
Oh, absolutely.
Like rhythmic sounds of tambourines, drums, chanting, all creating the necessary atmosphere to facilitate this connection.
Yes, music was vital for inducing that trance state in the shaman and also for attracting the attention of the spirits. The shaman's specific attire and ritualistic actions, like the use of a grass switch, for example, those also held symbolic significance within the seance. And it was commonly believed that the shaman would have no recollection of the events that transpired during the trance.
Oh, wow.
So it really underscores that idea that they were acting as a vessel for the spirit world.
And, Winstedt gives some pretty fascinating accounts of these seances, royal seances that were conducted during the illness of a sultan, but also more humble, like village seances that were aimed at, healing the afflicted or locating lost items.
Right. Very practical matters.
Yeah. And the types of spirits invoked, they could be quite varied.
Oh, yeah.
Even like powerful tiger spirits.
Yeah, tiger spirits. Very potent. What's interesting about the inclusion of these animal spirits, particularly ones as powerful as tigers, is that it suggests this deep respect for the natural world and a belief that certain creatures actually embody this inherent spiritual power.
Okay.
These animal spirits, they were often seen as possessing unique knowledge or abilities that the shaman could then access during the seance to benefit the community.
Right. And the royal seances, in particular, really demonstrate those close ties between like the shamanic tradition and the ruling class.
Yes, definitely.
You have this description of like the elaborate preparations for the seance conducted for Sultan Yusuf.
Right.
Involving a female shaman who was dressed as a man and this like 16-sided ritual stand.
Yeah.
And it really just shows this, profound importance placed on these rituals for the well-being of the state.
Absolutely. And the seance that was held to, quote unquote, revive the Perec Regalia is just this potent example of this syncretic blending of beliefs that we've been talking about. You have these invocations to spirits associated with royal power alongside these more indigenous spiritual elements.
That idea of like spiritually reviving the regalia it's quite evocative.
Yeah.
It implies that these objects weren't just like inert symbols of authority, but they actually possess this like vital spiritual energy that needed periodic renewal
Yeah, had to be reaffirmed.
through ritual.
Exactly.
And it's interesting that, both state and village magicians participated in these events. It
Right.
shows how, deeply ingrained these beliefs were
Yeah.
across these different levels of Malay society.
Absolutely.
Now, Winstedt also, he raises this really interesting point about, like, the potential element of make-believe in some shamanic trances.
Right.
He notes these instances where shamans seem to retain a degree of awareness of, like, social etiquette or personal needs while they were ostensibly, possessed.
Right.
So what does that suggest about, like, the nature of these experiences?
Well, it suggests that the boundary between genuine trance and, a degree of performance or enacted belief, that boundary may not always have been so clear cut.
Okay.
But regardless of the level of conscious control, the community's faith in the efficacy of these rituals, that remains strong.
Right.
The primary goal of the seances for the sick, it was generally to identify and expel or coax the malevolent spirit that was causing the illness from the sufferer's body.
Okay.
Often they would transfer it onto this symbolic food offering
Right.
as a way of, appeasing or banishing it.
Right. So magic, it wasn't confined to these formal ritualistic settings.
No, not at all.
It sounds like it permeated, like, the fabric of daily life, especially during significant life transitions. So why were these times considered, like, particularly susceptible to magical influence?
Well, because these were periods when individuals were considered particularly vulnerable
Right.
to negative spiritual influences, malevolent forces, and so specific magical interventions were required for protection, for well-being.
So let's start at the beginning, birth and infancy.
Okay.
The sheer number of, like, magical precautions taken by expectant parents. It's pretty remarkable. You've got these, like, iron talismans they're carrying, specific bathing rituals, even restrictions placed on, like, the husband's actions. It's really interesting.
It really speaks to the profound concern for the safety of both the mother and that child.
Yep.
And these practices, they were all intended to shield both the mother and the unborn child from harmful spirits and negative prenatal influences. So, the eclipse rituals, the prohibitions against harming animals, these likely stem from a belief in sympathetic magic, where actions could have direct, tangible consequences for the developing fetus.
Right.
And then you have these 7th-month pregnancy rituals, such as the lustration, the symbolic rocking ceremony with the doll. These appear to serve this dual purpose, to bless the coming child and maybe also to symbolically ease the process of childbirth.
And then you have the demon traps that they use during childbirth, like thorns and nests, even bees' nests
Right.
placed around the birthing area. It's just such a vivid illustration of, like, the perceived dangers and the lengths that people would go to for protection.
It really is.
And even after the birth, practices like the careful disposal of the placenta, specific rituals performed for a crying infant.
Yes.
It shows this continued focus on the baby's spiritual well-being.
Absolutely, in those early, very vulnerable stages.
Right. And then you move on to, like, adolescence. And even within the framework of, like, Islamic obligations, like circumcision, for instance.
Yeah.
We still see these magical elements kind of subtly interwoven.
We're there? Yeah.
The interpretation of omens that were observed during the ceremony.
Right.
The processions marking the event. Even, like, mock fights, which may have these older pre-Islamic roots.
Exactly.
These rites of passage, they were clearly imbued with this sense of magical significance.
Yeah.
That extended beyond, like, the purely religious aspects.
Absolutely. And then, of course, you have marriage, which is another fascinating area where these different traditions blended quite openly.
Yeah.
So you have courtship customs, the application of henna. Winstedt actually notes that henna has a wider presence in Muslim marriages, even as far as Morocco.
Interesting.
And then you have the lustration rituals and the formal sitting in state of the bridal couple. It's just this clear fusion of animistic, Hindu, and Islamic influences.
Right.
And you see the variations, like in the rites that were performed for widows, for example, that really highlights how these customs adapted to different life stages and social circumstances.
Yeah.
So there's this nuanced understanding of spiritual needs at different points in life.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then finally, death.
The final transition.
While, like, the standard Muslim burial rites were generally observed,
Yes.
there were still, like, distinct Malay superstitions and practices surrounding death that, went beyond purely religious doctrine,
Yeah.
like creating a hole in the roof specifically for the spirit of a black magic practitioner to escape, placing iron objects on the corpse, maintaining a constant vigil, imposing restrictions on noise. It all kind of suggests these underlying beliefs about the soul's journey after death.
He does.
And, the potential for malevolent forces to interfere, even at this, final stage.
Yeah, that vulnerability doesn't end with death. And then you have the elaborate burial rituals reserved for chiefs and royalty. The construction of those multi-tiered biers, the symbolic scattering of yellow rice and gold.
Right.
Those practices extended beyond mere expressions of respect. It suggests this belief in their continued spiritual influence, the necessity of ensuring a safe and honorable transition to the afterlife, especially for those of high status.
So, magic was clearly an active and